My jealous cousin slapped me right at the courthouse gate. He choked me, cuffed me, and spat in my face. Filthy animal. Family disgrace. My father stood 10 steps away, hands in his pockets, eyes cold as stone, and did nothing. No one said a word. Not the guards, not the clerks. Just the metallic snap of handcuffs sealing my wrists, echoing like a drumbeat of shame. But 5 minutes later, that same cousin froze. His smug grin faltered when he looked up and saw me sitting behind the judge's bench, the same bench he thought only carried authority for him. I didn't need revenge. I needed truth. And that morning, truth finally showed up wearing my name tag. My name is Corin Vale, and this is what it feels like when silence becomes heavier than betrayal. Before I share my story, I want to know you're here with me. Drop a comment saying listening, or tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Sometimes the smallest connection makes a story feel alive. And if this story touches something in you, subscribe to the channel. Every week, I share true stories of justice, family, and the quiet strength it takes to stand alone when everyone else turns away. Somewhere in these moments, you'll find a piece of yourself. Stay, listen, and let's make sure no one's silence goes unheard again. The air outside the Gallatin County Courthouse was sharp enough to sting. 8:12 a.m. Montana wind carried the smell of frost and exhaust. I adjusted the strap of my worn leather briefcase, its corners scuffed raw from years of dragging it across courthouse floors, and started up the stone steps. Each footfall echoed in the empty morning, a rhythm I matched with my heartbeat, steady but tense. Inside, I could feel the walls watching. The old oak panels and high ceilings seemed to anticipate conflict. The weight of family grudges hung in the air like smoke. I reminded myself of why I came here. Not for confrontation, not for pride, but for the truth, buried under lies, envy, and betrayal. And for the first time, I knew the silence surrounding my name would finally be broken. The family I thought I knew. My family always had two sides. One they showed the world, smiles, handshakes, the perfect Montana image of success. And one they reserved for themselves, whispers, grudges, and a cruel hierarchy that nobody outside the walls could see. I had grown up walking on eggshells, careful never to challenge my cousin Darius, the golden boy, the one who inherited charm and connections, while I inherited nothing but my father's silence. That day at the courthouse wasn't the first time Darius humiliated me. From the day we were teenagers, he had made it his mission to remind me that I was less than him. He would push me, belittle me in front of others, and yet somehow, whenever our father walked into the room, Darius transformed into the perfect son. It was a pattern that had followed me into adulthood, and every time I tried to fight back, I ended up more isolated than before. I had a plan that morning, though. I'd spent months preparing, researching the cases, studying court procedures, and familiarizing myself with the ins and outs of Montana's legal system. Nobody in my family knew I had been working on this quietly. Hours in the library, nights poring over precedent cases, weekends shadowing court hearings just to understand the mechanics. I wasn't just stepping into a courtroom that day. I was stepping into a battlefield where knowledge was my weapon. As I waited in the hallway, Darius's smug laugh echoed down the stone corridor. He thought this would be easy, that I would fold, that my father's silence meant I had no support. But he didn't know that years of watching injustice had forged me into someone patient and precise. My hands still tingled from the slap, the anger burning beneath the surface. But I didn't let it control me. Anger is loud. Strategy is silent. I remembered all the times I'd been ignored, dismissed, and branded unworthy by my family. Each memory fueled a quiet resolve. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to ruin him. I wanted justice. I wanted the truth to finally have a stage. And the audience was the very system that had been manipulated to favor him for years. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation. Lawyers shuffled papers. Clerks moved quickly between offices, and the soft hum of conversations filled the corridors. I kept my eyes on the bench. That chair wasn't just a symbol. It was my goal. Sitting there would be a statement, not of power, but of legitimacy. I had spent years quietly gathering the tools I needed, and now everything would be tested in the glare of fluorescent lights and the sharp stares of the court. Before the proceedings started, I took a deep breath and thought about my father, standing back all these years, letting Darius dominate every room. I realized then that silence had been our enemy, and knowledge our ally. Every detail I had studied, every case note I had annotated, every court observation I had recorded, it all led to this morning. And as the doors opened and the first witnesses took their seats, I understood one undeniable truth. The battlefield had been set, and for the first time, the family that had looked down on me for decades had no idea that I was no longer a pawn. The courtroom tension builds as I stepped into the courtroom. The familiar smell of polished wood and aged leather hit me. It was a smell that always reminded me of my childhood. The grandiose image of family authority, of power that was never earned but inherited. Darius was already there, seated in the gallery with his lawyer whispering in his ear, smirking like he owned the place. I felt a pang of anger but kept it under control. Anger, I reminded myself, is a luxury for the unprepared. Today, preparation would win. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge entered. I could see him glance at the files before looking up at the room, his gaze sweeping over the family, the lawyers, and finally landing on me. The weight of the moment pressed down, but I stood firm. This was my chance. The culmination of years of watching, learning, and strategizing. The first witness was called. It was a family friend who had observed years of manipulation within our household. The lawyer for Darius tried to discredit her immediately, but she held her ground, recounting instances where favoritism, intimidation, and coercion had been used to marginalize me. Each word struck like a hammer, breaking down the carefully constructed illusion that Darius was infallible, and that I was insignificant. I could feel Darius shift in his seat. His smirk faded, replaced by a tension I had never seen before. It was subtle at first, a tightening of the jaw, a quick glance to his lawyer. But it was there. That slight crack in his armor fueled my determination. I realized that truth, no matter how delayed, always has a way of surfacing. Next, I presented documents I had painstakingly collected over months. Emails, financial statements, and records showing favoritism in family trusts, business decisions, and even past legal arrangements that had systematically disadvantaged me. My lawyer guided me, but every revelation felt personal. This wasn't just about winning in court. It was about exposing the rot that had been allowed to flourish unchecked. The gallery whispered, the judge's expression hardened, and Darius's attorney grew increasingly flustered. Each point I made, each piece of evidence I revealed, chipped away at the foundation he had built his life on. I watched him squirm under the weight of facts he couldn't refute. It was a rare, almost poetic moment. The arrogant cousin who had spat in my face now realizing that his own misdeeds were no longer hidden. As the day stretched on, more witnesses took the stand. Colleagues, family friends, even neighbors, all painting the same picture. A pattern of manipulation and favoritism that had kept me at the bottom while Darius thrived. The cumulative effect was powerful. The courtroom, once a place where I had felt powerless, had transformed into an arena where I held the advantage. By the time the first session ended, the tension was palpable. Darius avoided my gaze entirely, his confidence diminished, replaced by unease. I knew this was just the beginning, but it was a crucial first step. The truth had begun to pierce the veil, and nothing could stop it now. And as I left the courtroom that afternoon, the winter wind biting at my face, I realized something important. This battle wasn't just about family grudges or vindication. It was about reclaiming the dignity that had been stolen from me, piece by piece, moment by moment. The confrontation that shook the courtroom the next morning. I returned to the courthouse with a quiet sense of purpose. I knew Darius would be on edge. His arrogance hadn't prepared him for a challenge that didn't crumble under intimidation. I could feel the shift in the air the moment I stepped into the hall. Whispers from clerks, curious glances from families waiting for their hearings, even a subtle nod from a bailiff who seemed to recognize that something unusual was unfolding. When the session began, Darius immediately tried to regain control. He leaned back in his chair, smirking, confident that his charm and inherited power could undo the momentum I had built. But the court had seen patterns, evidence, witnesses, and documentation that even his charisma couldn't erase. I watched him, every twitch, every nervous glance, knowing that the seed of doubt had been planted. My lawyer called the next witness, an accountant who had worked closely with our family's trust. The room fell silent as she laid out the numbers, showing how resources had consistently been diverted to favor Darius, leaving me excluded from opportunities that were legally and morally mine. She described hidden clauses in contracts and unexplained transfers of assets, all meticulously documented and undeniable. Each revelation tightened the tension in the courtroom like a coiled spring. Darius's smirk faded entirely. He whispered frantic instructions to his attorney, who was clearly struggling to find a defense against facts that were both precise and damning. I could see panic flicker across Darius's face for the first time in my life, a flash of vulnerability that made years of humiliation feel like a distant memory. When I took the stand, I remained calm. I recounted my experiences. The slaps, the insults, the feeling of invisibility within my own family. I spoke about being dismissed, about the coldness I endured while Darius prospered. Every word was measured, every pause intentional, letting the courtroom absorb the weight of decades of manipulation and favoritism. The gallery was attentive. Even the judge leaned forward, nodding as he listened. My father, who had once stood silent, avoided my gaze entirely. I knew he felt the exposure coming, the uncomfortable truth that his favoritism had consequences beyond family dynamics. Then came the pivotal moment. I addressed Darius directly, not with anger, but with unwavering certainty. You believed that intimidation and cruelty would protect you, but the truth doesn't bend. The truth doesn't fear scrutiny. Today the court sees what I have lived with for years. A hush fell over the room. Darius's lawyer attempted an objection, but the judge waved him off. The energy had shifted. The courtroom, once an arena where Darius dominated by legacy and charm, now felt like a place where justice, slow, deliberate, undeniable, was unfolding. As the session ended, Darius left without a word, his confidence shattered. I stayed behind, taking a moment to look at the bench, imagining what it would feel like to occupy that seat with authority. Not inherited, but earned through persistence, preparation, and truth. Outside, the winter air stung my cheeks, but it no longer felt like punishment. It felt like possibility. I knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, I understood that the tide had turned, and I was no longer powerless. The climax begins. Taking the bench, the following morning, I arrived at the courthouse with a sense of quiet determination. Today wasn't just another hearing. It was the day I would step into the judge's seat, a symbol not just of authority, but of justice reclaimed. Darius arrived first, already radiating his familiar overconfidence. He greeted no one but himself, offering that same smirk he had worn my entire life. But beneath the surface, I could sense unease. Something had shifted overnight. The courtroom was packed. Family members, local attorneys, and curious onlookers filled the benches. The air felt thick with anticipation, each breath heavy as though the building itself knew a reckoning was coming. I kept my eyes on the bench, imagining the weight of authority it carried, a seat that had once represented power for my cousin, now waiting for me to claim it. When my lawyer motioned for the judge's recusal, citing a conflict of interest in prior rulings that had favored Darius, the room went silent. The judge, a seasoned veteran, looked momentarily surprised but agreed to step aside, handing temporary authority to me as a visiting magistrate for this hearing. I took a deep breath and adjusted my robes. My heart pounded, but not with fear, with purpose. Darius froze when he saw me seated behind the bench. His eyes widened slightly, his confidence faltering. This was the moment when the power dynamics shifted. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet irreversibly. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply began the proceedings. The first testimony focused on past family disputes, inheritance issues, and instances of intimidation that Darius had wielded like weapons. Witnesses recounted events meticulously, laying bare the patterns of favoritism and cruelty that had shaped my life. As I listened and asked pointed questions, I realized how much weight perception carries. The way the courtroom hung on my words, nodding subtly, leaning forward, waiting for the narrative to unfold. Darius tried to interrupt, tried to assert control, but every objection was countered with evidence, documents, and testimony that he couldn't escape. His lawyer's frustration was palpable, mirroring the tension that now radiated from my cousin himself. For the first time, he was on the defensive, reacting to facts rather than dictating the story. I called a series of witnesses who revealed years of manipulations, financial misdirection, and social exclusion that Darius had orchestrated with subtle cruelty. Each revelation chipped away at his persona, exposing the insecurities he had masked with arrogance. The courtroom absorbed every detail, and I could feel the tide turning with every word. By mid-afternoon, it became evident. This wasn't just a procedural hearing. This was the culmination of years of preparation, strategy, and quiet observation. Today, I wasn't just a plaintiff or a relative seeking justice. I was the arbiter of truth, seated above the very person who had caused me years of pain. As the session ended, I rose, removed my robes, and looked down at Darius. He didn't meet my gaze. Instead, he slumped in his chair, the weight of decades of misdeeds settling upon him like a storm finally breaking. Outside, the wind bit cold, but I felt a sense of warmth, the warmth of silent vindication, justice, and finally, balance restored. The next hearing was unlike anything I had anticipated. Word had spread about my unexpected rise to the bench, and the courthouse was packed with curious onlookers. Every whisper seemed to echo through the high ceilings. A reminder that what happened here wasn't just a personal victory. It was becoming a spectacle. My cousin Darius arrived with his usual arrogance, but there was a subtle edge to his movements. He was no longer untouchable. He could feel the tide turning, and that awareness made him dangerous. I reviewed the files on my desk carefully. The documents, meticulously compiled over months, told a story no one could deny. Contracts, letters, bank statements, emails. Each piece a puzzle revealing the true picture of years of manipulation, favoritism, and deceit. Today I would show the court exactly how Darius had constructed his facade, and I would do it without malice, only truth. The session began with my lawyer calling forward a key witness, a former family accountant who had grown weary of the constant pressure from Darius's side. She spoke plainly, detailing how funds had been shifted, decisions had been influenced, and opportunities had been withheld from me. The courtroom hung on every word. Even Darius's attorney struggled to maintain composure, realizing that the evidence couldn't be spun. When it was my turn to speak, I did not shout, I did not plead. I asked questions that allowed the witnesses to lay out the facts themselves. Each revelation reinforced what I had known for years. The family's hierarchy was built on deception, and I had been systematically silenced. But the difference now was that the courtroom was listening, and for the first time, my silence had power. Darius tried to interject, trying to derail the momentum with interruptions and pointed remarks. But the judge, who had observed the prior sessions, allowed the facts to speak for themselves. My questions were precise, each one designed to draw out truth, not opinion. And with each answer, the courtroom tension grew. It wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was a psychological game. By mid-session, I noticed a change in Darius. The smirk he wore so confidently was gone. He was leaning back, jaw tight, hands fidgeting, subtle signs of panic. His authority, once absolute in this family and this courthouse, was crumbling under the weight of reality. I paused and looked around the room, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Family, lawyers, onlookers, they all saw the shift. They saw that the cousin who once humiliated me was now exposed. The evidence wasn't just paper. It was the story of my life, my struggles, and my resilience. The session ended with the judge promising to review all documents in detail, noting that the pattern of manipulation and favoritism would need to be addressed before any further decisions. I left the courtroom that afternoon knowing that while the final verdict wasn't yet delivered, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. As I walked out into the cold Montana air, I felt a mix of relief and anticipation. The fight wasn't over, but the trajectory was clear. Truth was finally on my side, and the days of silent oppression were numbered. The following morning, I walked into the courthouse with a sense of quiet determination. Today was the pivotal moment, the day I would take the bench, not just as an observer, but as someone empowered by truth and preparation. My cousin Darius arrived early, wearing his usual air of arrogance, but I could sense the subtle tremor of unease in his movements. He was no longer untouchable. As the court session began, I adjusted my robe and seated myself behind the bench. The polished wood felt heavy under my hands, and yet it carried a power that had been denied to me for years. Darius's smug expression faltered the moment he looked up and saw me occupying the seat he had always imagined himself in. It wasn't revenge. It was justice, and the shift was palpable. The first witness took the stand, recounting years of manipulation and intimidation within our family. I listened, nodding, guiding the questioning with precise focus. Each detail built the narrative that Darius had spent decades suppressing. Emails, financial statements, contracts. All the evidence I had painstakingly collected now laid bare his pattern of deceit. The courtroom absorbed every word, every revelation striking like a hammer against the false image he had carefully constructed. Darius tried to speak, to assert control, but each objection was swiftly countered with documentation, precedent, and testimony. His lawyer struggled to keep pace, his authority crumbling under the weight of undeniable facts. I realized then that truth was not just a weapon, it was a force that could not be ignored. I addressed Darius directly, calmly, but firmly. For years, intimidation and favoritism defined your power. Today, the court sees the reality of your actions. Authority built on manipulation cannot stand when exposed to scrutiny. The words hung in the room, heavy and precise. Darius's jaw tightened. The mask of confidence cracked. The following hours were a whirlwind of testimonies, counter-arguments, and detailed examinations of evidence. Each moment reinforced the shift in power. The courtroom, once a place where Darius ruled by family legacy and inherited influence, now listened to facts and truth, my truth. By late afternoon, it was clear. The narrative had changed. Darius's dominance, cultivated over decades, was dismantled piece by piece. His arrogance had been replaced by tension, disbelief, and an emerging fear. The audience, witnesses, and even court officials recognized the transformation. When the session adjourned, I remained seated for a moment, absorbing the weight of what had occurred. I had stepped into the judge's seat not out of spite, but because I had earned it through patience, strategy, and perseverance. The power dynamics had shifted irrevocably, and for the first time, I could see the path to justice stretching before me. Outside, Montana's cold wind bit at my cheeks, but I felt warmth, a quiet, satisfying affirmation that truth, preparation, and resilience had combined to level the playing field at last. The real work wasn't over, but the turning point had arrived. The next court session began with a tension that was nearly tangible. Word had spread about my unexpected presence behind the bench, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Every glance, every hushed whisper, every subtle movement carried weight. Darius arrived with his usual confidence, but it was weaker now, tainted by the knowledge that he no longer held the upper hand. He kept glancing at me, as if my calm composure and quiet authority were a new, unfamiliar force he couldn't comprehend. I reviewed the evidence one last time before the proceedings started. Letters, contracts, emails, and financial documents meticulously compiled over months. Each piece reinforced the story I had been telling the court. A story of favoritism, manipulation, and decades of intentional exclusion. This was no longer just about family grudges. It was about exposing the truth and reclaiming the dignity and respect that had been denied to me for years. As the session commenced, witnesses were called one by one. Their testimonies were precise, deliberate, and undeniable. Family friends described the calculated ways Darius had maintained control, how he had leveraged influence and intimidation to ensure that I remained in the shadows. My own attorney skillfully guided each witness, ensuring that the facts were presented clearly and cohesively. I observed Darius closely. Each revelation, each new piece of evidence presented, chipped away at his confidence. His smirk was gone, replaced by a tense rigidity, and his hands fidgeted nervously on the bench. The arrogance he had relied on for years was melting, replaced by an unspoken recognition that the game had shifted, and I was now the one holding the cards. When it was my turn to speak, I remained calm, precise, and deliberate. I summarized the patterns, connected the evidence, and asked questions that guided the witnesses to elaborate on the injustices I had endured. Every word, every question, every subtle gesture reinforced my authority in the room. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight of respect, not because of intimidation or inheritance, but because of truth and preparation. By the end of the session, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The courtroom that had once been a theater of Darius's power was now a space where justice, diligence, and perseverance commanded attention. The witnesses had spoken, the evidence had been laid bare, and Darius, the man who had humiliated me in front of family and peers, could only watch as the structure he had relied on crumbled before him. Leaving the courthouse, the Montana wind felt different, sharper, yes, but invigorating. The cold stung, but it also reminded me that this victory, though not yet finalized, was real and tangible. The battle had reached a turning point. The silence and oppression that had defined my life for years had finally been replaced with recognition, respect, and the undeniable presence of truth. And as I walked past the courthouse steps, I felt a surge of clarity. This wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The start of a life where I would no longer be sidelined, where my voice, my efforts, and my integrity were recognized and honored. After that decisive session, the courthouse buzzed with whispers that followed me out the doors. People I had never met nodded subtly, some offering small words of encouragement. The tide had turned, and it was no longer just my family watching. The entire court system had begun to acknowledge the truth. Darius, once untouchable, had lost the invisible armor he had worn for decades. His arrogance had been replaced with tension, and the people who had quietly supported him now looked at him with hesitation. I walked back to my car, replaying every moment of the day in my head. The subtle looks, the carefully orchestrated testimonies, the way the courtroom had collectively shifted its attention from my cousin to the facts. It all felt surreal. For years, I had been invisible, dismissed, and belittled. But now, visibility meant power. Not vengeance, but recognition. That distinction mattered. The following days were a whirlwind of reactions. My father, who had stood silent when I was humiliated, finally approached me. His words were few, awkward, but tinged with understanding. "You've changed the story," he admitted. "I didn't realize how much was stacked against you." It was not an apology, but acknowledgement, and in that moment, it felt like a piece of the long-lost respect had returned. Darius, predictably, became defensive. Attempts to discredit the witnesses and challenge the evidence continued. But each effort only reminded everyone that the foundation of his control had been exposed. His lawyer struggled to contain the unraveling narrative, and every courtroom appearance seemed to chip away at the credibility he had relied on for so long. Outside the courthouse, the community began to react. Neighbors, colleagues, and even distant relatives reached out, some with congratulations, some with curiosity. I realized how much the story of our family had been a microcosm of power, favoritism, and manipulation. By exposing the truth, I was not only reclaiming my dignity, but also changing the narrative that others had accepted for decades. In private moments, I reflected on what had truly changed. It wasn't just the legal victories or the exposure of my cousin's misdeeds. It was the understanding that preparation, patience, and adherence to truth could overcome years of oppression. I felt a quiet sense of empowerment that was more profound than any fleeting victory. The satisfaction came not from watching Darius falter, but from knowing I had reclaimed my voice and integrity. As the weeks passed, the family dynamics began to shift. Conversations that had once been dominated by manipulation now carried the weight of accountability. My presence in the courtroom, my unwavering commitment to the truth, had set a precedent. And while some relationships would never fully recover, the foundation of fairness and recognition had been laid. That realization, that silence can be transformed into authority, that injustice can be countered with knowledge and persistence, became my guiding principle. I had faced humiliation, betrayal, and doubt, yet emerged not only vindicated, but strengthened. The battle for truth had reshaped not only my life, but the perception of my family, proving that integrity and patience can ultimately prevail against arrogance and deceit. Sitting back in my home that evening, I finally allowed myself to breathe. The whirlwind of the courtroom, the tension, the months of preparation, it all settled into a quiet, satisfying stillness. Darius's power had been dismantled, but more importantly, my voice had been heard. For the first time in decades, I felt seen, respected, and validated. I thought about the moments that had led me here. The slaps, the insults, the cold stares, the years of being overlooked and dismissed. Each of those experiences had fueled a determination that never wavered. Every hour I had spent studying, preparing, and collecting evidence had been worth it. I had turned silence into strategy, humiliation into motivation, and doubt into clarity. The courtroom had not only changed my relationship with my cousin, it had transformed my understanding of power and justice. I realized that authority is not given. It is earned through patience, persistence, and adherence to truth. Darius had relied on intimidation and legacy, but I had relied on preparation and resilience. And in the end, resilience always wins. As I reflected on the events, I knew this story wasn't just mine. It was a reminder that even when people around you doubt you, when family undermines you, or when life seems stacked against you, it is possible to reclaim your dignity. It takes courage, strategy, and unwavering commitment, but the reward is far greater than revenge. It is the restoration of self-respect and justice. To anyone watching this, remember, silence does not mean weakness, and oppression does not mean defeat. The battles you fight quietly can define the strength you carry forever. And sometimes, the person who seemed powerless is the one who ultimately changes everything.